Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Grand Teton National Park in northwest Wyoming. The park is located only about 130 miles to the south of Yellowstone National Park and rivals it with its beauty and wildlife. Elevation in the park starts at 6,320 feet in Jackson Hole and stretches to 13,770 feet at the park's highest point, Grand Teton. The barren granite peaks give way to thick forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees, with quaking aspen groves dominating in pockets across the valleys. Near Jackson Lake is a trail system that travels eastward to Emma Matilda Lake and Two Ocean Lake. The Emma Matilda Lake Trail encircles Emma Matilda Lake in a loop that runs almost 12 miles. It wanders through meadows and trees as cool breezes waft off the lake to refresh visitors as they hike. Stands of buffalo berries offer a tasty treat to passers-by and sustain the wildlife in their season. Common animals in this area include elk, moose, and mule deer. Predators in this area include black bear, bobcats, cougars, coyotes, and wolves, but the most powerful are the massive grizzlies that frequent the trails. During the second week of August 1994, 36-year-old Michael and Linda Dunn were camping with their 3 children at the Coulter Bay Campground along Jackson Lake. Their family had a standing vacation spent at the lake each year and enjoyed the time together each summer. Michael was thin but athletic, standing 6 feet in height and weighing a healthy 165 pounds. He was a scout leader back in their hometown of Park City, Utah, and had even completed bear attack training with his pack of scouts. Michael was a successful senior writer at Fotherington & Associates, eventually landing the same position with Bonneville Communications. His life was centered around serving his community, and he took pride in his campaigns for a Major League Baseball team as well as the Salvation Army. Michael and Linda were not only life partners, but they were running partners. Together they had completed 50 marathons combined, including ultra ultramarathons. They valued the lessons running instilled in them, teaching their kids that they could still find joy while doing difficult things. They had even completed an Ironman race together. On this particular day, Michael wanted to go on a longer run, and Linda agreed to stay behind with the kids. As Michael prepared for his early morning run on August 14th, he had a sense of doom wash over him. He knew it was something he'd have to work through and hit the trail before sunup. Falling into an easy pace, his mind began reflecting on lessons he found valuable. As a member of the Latter-day Saint Church, he felt running in the mountains helped him clear his mind and meditate. He used this solitary time running to pray and seek direction from God. As he bounced along the trail, he reflected on the prior day's run. That morning had been moistened by the dew, and as he entered a meadow, he decided it would be a beautiful place for his morning prayers. Inspired by the sunlight breaking across the cloud-shrouded peaks, he knelt down and prayed aloud a prayer of gratitude when 2 words popped into his mind. Play dead. The meaning of these words were confusing to him that morning, but would be very important this morning. Only a few hundred yards into his run, Michael noticed a strange bush near the trail. Around the base of this bush were several buffalo berries that had been dislodged from their stems. The tiny tomato-like fruits led Michael's eyes to the indelible impression of a large grizzly track deeply embedded into the dirt near the bush. Perhaps out of nervous relief, but definitely as a precaution, Michael decided he would start singing out loud as he ran. He didn't pack a firearm, nor did he pack bear spray on any of his runs. Around 2 miles into his run, Michael's nerves began to settle down, and he quit singing out loud. As he rounded a bend in the trail, he was discombobulated by a loud, deep rumble just off the trail a few yards from him. At first he thought a boulder was rolling down the slope, but turned around to see a huge grizzly sow bellowing at him from only 15 yards away. He stared at her as events unfolded in slow motion in his mind. He could see the muscles in the hump of her shoulder ripple as she blew through every limb and bush between them. Popping and cracking sounded as she growled a thundering roar as she bore down on him. Michael immediately began to run and scream in terror. She caught up to him within only a few yards and barreled into him like a freight train, knocking him 9 feet off the trail. It seemed that the sow was on top of him before he even hit the ground. He yelled for help and punched the sow in the face as she slashed at his flesh. Her roaring and growling gave way to eerily silent and furious swats with her claws. Each time the bear tried to bite him, Michael tried to squirm out of the way. He screamed at the top of his lungs, trying to frighten the bear, but felt himself panicking as he felt the sow's claws rip through his neck, legs, and arms. With a single swat, she flipped him over onto his stomach and wrapped her claws around the right side of his face. She was standing on his back and pulled his head up toward his rear end, trying to break his neck. As one of her claws slipped from his mouth, it tore a deep gash from the corner of his mouth to above and behind his right ear. He hoped that the bear would stop her attack, but realized that she was doing what bears do, kill their prey. Thoughts of his wife and kids flashed through his mind. He wondered if he would ever see them again, and decided to do the only thing he could, pray. The bear was far too powerful for him to resist her ferocity. He curled into the fetal position and focused on slowing his breathing and remaining still. The bear suddenly glanced around as if it had heard something nearby. It dashed off about 20 yards down the trail and stood to its hind feet. Michael marveled at the bear as it stood to what he estimated to be 7 to 9 feet in height. The sow dropped to all fours and disappeared into the trees as if something was chasing her. After the sow disappeared, Michael knew he was severely injured. He was afraid she would come back and quickly regained his feet. His blood poured from so many wounds on his body that he couldn't tell precisely where it was coming from. He knew he needed to do something to stop the bleeding, so he removed his shirt and ripped it into ribbons. Michael wrapped the ribbons around his gashed thigh as a makeshift tourniquet. None of his bones seemed to be broken, so he knew that he had to put as much distance as he could between himself and the sow. The closest place Michael knew he'd be able to find help was back at Jackson Lodge near Jackson Lake, about 5 miles away. He wasn't sure if he could make it all the way back to the lodge, but knew he could make himself easier to find for possible rescuers. As he limped his way back down the trail, he was presented with a confusing series of trail junctions that could have led him further from help. Somehow he made his way for 1 mile before deciding to lay down and rest in a beautiful meadow. Michael laid in the trail for about 45 minutes before a man and 2 women stumbled upon him. They were photographers visiting the park and were hailed by Michael for help. The man agreed to run for help and clomped his way down the trail along a fire road in his heavy hiking boots. The women stayed with Michael, wrapping him in a blanket and carefully giving him sips of water to keep him comfortable. Around 90 minutes later, a park ranger hiked up to Michael's location with a first aid kit. He was followed by a second ranger, who notified the group that a helicopter was en route to evacuate Michael. Back at Coulter Bay Campground, Linda began to wonder where Michael had gone. She knew he wanted to go for a longer run, but he should have been back a long time ago. She rounded up the kids, and they all got on their bikes and pedaled toward the lodge to get some help in finding him. As they rode, they ran into some park rangers who informed them that Michael had been attacked by a grizzly bear and was on a helicopter to St. John's Hospital in Jackson Hole. Rangers began an immediate investigation into Michael's attack. They measured the distance on the trail to the point where he was attacked, about 2.1 miles. They analyzed the bear tracks as she ran toward Michael and measured the distance between where he was struck and where he had landed at 9.2 feet. The bushes between where she impacted him and where he had landed had been flattened by the sheer power of the sprinting bear. At his attack scene, the rangers found his carbon fiber sunglasses with a clear pointed dent in them where the sow's claw had impacted. His sunglasses prevented Michael from losing an eye that day. Once Michael arrived at St. John's, he had a run of good luck. A world-renowned trauma surgeon happened to be visiting that day and helped save Michael's life. Upon observing Michael's injuries, they marveled that 2 of the bear's claws tore parallel gashes through his thigh and perfectly paralleled his femoral artery in the middle, in between them. They created a deep wound channel that the artery fell into, protecting it from any further damage. They were also amazed that the deep gash to his neck missed his carotid artery by 1 millimeter. Had either one of these injuries severed one of those major arteries, Michael would have bled to death in seconds. Michael's arms, legs, neck, and back were covered in deep gashes and bites. They were similar to injuries sustained in a high-speed motorcycle accident. Michael made it through 2 surgeries in the following 3 days to close 16 wounds that required 300 stitches. The surgeries were successful, and Michael's condition was improved to stable. The following nights, Michael would wake up fighting the bear off in imagined attacks that tortured him and his family. The mental anguish from the attack would require therapy for months to come. During his 7-day stay in the hospital, Michael's children visited him. In order to soften the blow of seeing their father torn to ribbons, he asked them if they understood what this means. They stared back blankly in their childhood innocence, and he said they should never feed the bears. It took Michael a 3rd surgery and weeks of painful rehabilitation to regain the ability to walk with a limp. Within 1 year, he completed the St. George Marathon in personal record time and went on to run in the Boston Marathon the following spring. Wearing a bear-patterned shirt and sporting teddy bear gifts on his table, his sense of humor has helped him and his family deal with the stress. A bear crossing sign was posted outside his front door by friends just to lighten his mood whenever he saw it. Michael Dunn was the first person to be attacked by a grizzly bear in Teton National Park's 54-year history. His family has returned to Jackson Lake each year, and Michael has been left with a greater desire to serve people and break outside his own private world. As for the sow and her cubs, I could find no source indicating that any action was taken against her or her cubs. She was left to raise her cubs unfettered by human intervention, given her defensive actions were deemed to be within the expected behavior of a sow grizzly protecting herself and her cubs. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think Michael should have listened to his feeling of impending doom before he went on his run? Do you think the words, "play dead," popping into his head after his prayer in the meadow were a harbinger from his guardian angel? Was it divine intervention that no major artery was severed during Michael's attack, or just good luck? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Cascade Creek, just 3.5 miles from the location of our previous episode on Buford Creek, discussing Mangi. Cascade Creek flows south, about 3.5 miles into the west fork of the Madison River. The valley bottom is over 8,200 feet high in elevation, and the mountains around it reach over 9,500 feet high. The climate here is a subalpine climate, with mild summer temperatures and cold winter temperatures. The gravelies are the perfect habitat for grizzly bears, with abundant sources of food and remoteness granting few human interlopers. The White Park pine trees provide a much-needed source of nutrients for bears, and the abundant elk population provides prey for them to hunt. The slopes are decorated with brilliant arrays of color when the willows and quaking aspen begin to drop their leaves in the fall. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir stands give way to protein-filled grasses and sage meadows below. Elk aren't the only prey for the grizzlies in the gravelies. Deer and moose also flourish here. They in turn provide food for the black bears, cougars, coyotes, and wolves here. Grizzlies also hunt the prey animals here and frequently confront human hunters in dangerous and deadly interactions. On Friday, September 17, 2010, 49-year-old surveyor Kim Wunderlich was elk hunting with 3 of his elk hunting buddies. It was his birthday, and what better place to spend it than elk hunting with your friends? Kim and Mike Drent were natives of Kalispell, while 66-year-old John Wasser was visiting from Stillwater, Minnesota, and 64-year-old Bob Markue came from Minnetonka, Minnesota. The men were all traditional bow hunters who believed in using primitive versions of archery equipment. Modern bows include cams and cables, which give the user a mechanical advantage, but traditional bows are built from wood and require more skill to shoot accurately. The men have hunted together for several years and enjoyed the time in the woods together. Markue and Wunderlich met while trout fishing and became fast friends immediately a few years before this attack. Now on the second day of their bow hunt, the hunters woke well before dawn and jumped onto their ATVs for the 5-mile ride to the location they wanted to hunt. They hiked into a creek drainage and managed to find a herd of elk in the timber. Drent and Markue decided to go one way on a ridge, and Wasser and Wunderlich headed the other way. They planned to meet back up at the top of the small ridge after they worked the timber in hopes of getting a shot at an elk. After getting close to a few bulls, but were unable to get a shot, Wunderlich and Wasser began to climb back toward their four-wheelers in the heat of the day. By early afternoon, Wasser and Wunderlich were working their way around a slope through some dark timber. They were within a few feet of each other when they heard a large twig snap uphill from them. As they both turned their heads, they saw a couple of bear cubs standing on their hind legs and staring at the men from about 25 yards away. The next thing they knew, a huge and angry sow grizzly was closing in on them at full speed. Now is a good time to mention how prepared or unprepared Wasser and Wunderlich were to run into a grizzly. There is no source indicating either of the men were carrying bear spray or a firearm. They were hunting with traditional archery equipment for that sense of participating in nature, as our ancestors did, but the experience they would have that day was far more primitive than what they bargained for. Wasser watched as the bear closed in on the men with anger in her eyes. He could tell she was not bluffing, and was coming to kill what she perceived as a threat to herself and her cubs. Wunderlich managed to yell "Bear!" before hiding behind a small tree. His movement drew the sow's full attention, and she immediately bounded in his direction. His eyes were drawn to her open mouth and her claws as she tore toward him. For the record, I am a bow hunter myself. I've often wondered what I would do if I were to encounter a bear sprinting toward me. I imagined myself using my bow as a defensive shield to keep the bear's teeth away from me while stabbing at it with my arrows with my other hand. The difference between what you can do and what you can only try to do is where the speed of a bear points out the flaws in your plans. Wunderlich lifted his wooden bow and extended his arm as a shield between himself and the grizzly. Her mouth was wide open, and he stuffed his bow into her mouth, but a 500-pound grizzly bear at full speed is far too powerful to be stopped by a man with his bow for a shield. The impact of the grizzly knocked Wunderlich tumbling for 20 yards down the slope. By the time he'd stopped rolling, the sow had regained her feet and had pounced on top of him. Wasser was still frozen at the men's original spot up the hill. His tactic of remaining still had been successful in not drawing the grizzly's attention to him, but was unsuccessful in keeping her from focusing on Wunderlich's movement. He yelled at the grizzly as it straddled Wunderlich and worked to knock an arrow on his bowstring. Wunderlich was stunned by the impact of the sow and could only watch as she stood over him. He was terrified that the grizzly might bite him by the head or neck and reached his hands out, trying to fend her jaws away from himself. The sow pushed through his hands and clamped her jaws onto the inner part of his thigh, only a few inches from his crotch. In a single powerful bite, she tore holes in his leg the size of 50-cent pieces. Wunderlich knew he couldn't fight her off, and given he was on his back, knew his only chance at survival depended on his ability to remain still. After the sow tore into Wunderlich's thigh, Wasser saw her spin and run back up the hill in the direction of her cubs. He watched her disappear while he was still trying to put the arrow on his bowstring. After making sure the sow and her cubs were heading away from them, Wasser made his way down to Wunderlich's side. He could see Wunderlich's arrows and other gear scattered around, but was amazed that his hunting partner was already standing on his feet. Wunderlich could feel blood steadily flowing down his thighs, but refused to look at his injuries to avoid revealing the severity of them to himself. Wasser packed Wunderlich's thigh wounds with gauze and wrapped it tightly. The men slowly worked their way back down the ridge for 1.5 miles while yelling for Drenth and Marku. After locating their hunting partners, the hunters made their way back to Drenth's pickup truck. They helped Wunderlich into the cab of the truck and bounced and skidded their way 70 miles on backcountry roads to the clinic at Dillon, arriving at 8:15 at night. Now Dillon is a dot of a town, smaller than a dot missing the T. The small clinic there managed to clean and bandage Wunderlich's thigh wound, and were thankful to note the bear's bite had just missed puncturing his femoral artery by a single centimeter. Wunderlich was released to heal at his home eventually. His elk hunting season was over, but he wasn't seriously injured, and managed to escape with all his fingers and toes intact. On the drive to Dillon, Drenth told Wunderlich that he and Marku were uphill from where Wunderlich was attacked. The sow had fled up the hill with her cubs and ran right into the other 2 members of the hunting party. Marku and Drenth managed to yell at her, and she veered off in her escape. They were very close to being her next victims. When asked about his thoughts on the grizzly bear attack on Wunderlich, Wasser said that a bazooka wouldn't have stopped that sow from attacking that day. She was so fast and angry that she could have done whatever she had wanted to the men, and they would have been powerless to stop her. When asked how he was feeling after the grizzly's attack, Wunderlich stated that he had peace about the event due to his faith. He said he was protected that day, in a spiritual sense. After Wunderlich's attack, Wasser and Marku were so disheartened by the event that they immediately packed their gear and returned home. They swore off ever returning to hunt in those woods again. They also commented on how unbelievably tough Wunderlich was in dealing with the trauma and pain of his injuries. Following reports on Wunderlich's grizzly attack, the area was cordoned off and warning signs were posted to keep people out of the location. DNA evidence from the sow was gathered from Wunderlich's clothing to compare to future samples in the event of further attacks. The authorities regarded the sow's attack as a defensive attack, given she fled the area and didn't try to do more damage to Wunderlich than she did. They also refused to indicate that the sow that attacked Wunderlich was the same bear that attacked Mangi only 5 days prior. They took no action against the sow and her cubs. Wunderlich eventually made a full recovery, but I could find no source indicating if he'd ever ventured back into the woods to continue archery hunting. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think it was the same bear that attacked Wunderlich and Mangi? Why did the sow run away from Drenth and Markio at the top of the ridge instead of attacking one or both of them? What additional actions should authorities take to protect hunters and bears? The next time you're in the woods and you hear a twig snap, will you try to hide behind a tree or try to remain still? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the southern range of the Gravelly Mountains in southwestern Montana. The Beaver Head Deer Lodge National Forest is home to the West Fork of the Madison River and is only 34 miles as the crow flies from the western boundary of Yellowstone National Park. The Gravellys, as locals refer to the range, consist of 310,000 acres of primitive and rugged mountains divided by only 9 road systems. The climate here is a subalpine climate with summer temperatures rarely cresting 80 degrees and winter temperatures dipping to 10 degrees below zero. It isn't uncommon for frost to occur at any time of year here. Toward the south end of the Gravellys, the West Fork of the Madison River sits in a valley bottom that starts at 7,000 feet in elevation and rises to over 9,000 feet at nearby peaks. On the west end of the drainage lies Buford Creek. The hills around Buford Creek are covered in a patchwork of thick stands of Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, whitebark pine, and pockets of quaking aspen trees, interrupted by expansive stretches of grass and brush. When you think of prime grizzly habitat, the Gravellys are what comes to mind. Common animals here include white-tailed deer, elk, and moose, with the dominant predators being black bears, cougars, coyotes, and wolves, with grizzly bears increasingly being observed by visitors. On Sunday, September 12, 2010, Matt Mangi was enjoying an archery elk hunting trip with one of his friends, whom we will call Mark. The Bozeman native had planned the trip with his hunting partner over the past few weeks, and the men knew right where they wanted to go. The open meadows of the lower part of Buford Creek give way to thick patches of trees along the hillsides. Elk hunters use the edges between meadows and stands of timber to look for elk sign and game trails to give them insight into where the elk herds may be bedded for the day. Each evening the elk herd make their way from their day beds to the river at the bottom of the valley. After the elk drink about 4 gallons of water each day, they make their way back to their day beds in the early morning to rest during the heat of the day. Now, a bit of information about bear anatomy and archery hunting is needed to understand just how this attack unfolded. Archery hunters typically dress head to toe in camouflage clothing so they can best blend into the plants around where they're hunting. Deer, elk, and moose see bright colors, like blaze orange, as mottled gray and tan tones, but bears see them vividly, like humans do. Bears have color vision, so wearing camouflage can make it more difficult for them to see a person. Bears also have round pupils and forward-facing eyes, which give them depth and detail of visual perception. If what they're looking at is not at the point their eyes are focusing, then the image lacks detail, much like our peripheral vision. Prey animals have horizontal pupils, giving them a less detailed but broader visual field. These visual adaptations allow them to react quickly to the movements of a predator without identifying exactly what it is. A basic rule is this: if your camo can fool a human's eye, it can fool a bear's eye. Archery hunters frequently use natural scents to mask any human odor that may emanate from their own bodies. Many use scent neutralizers to remove perfumes and laundry soap in the woods hard to detect by the sensitive noses of elk, and for that matter, grizzly bears. On this Sunday, events had unfolded much like the others. Matt and Mark had planned a hunt starting before sunup and wound their way through the thick timber until mid-morning. Having seen tracks and sign, they cautiously stalked the herd from different approach angles, working themselves into a position to shoot. Matt and Mark had planned a hunt starting before sunup and wound their way through the thick timber until mid-morning. Having seen tracks and sign, they cautiously stalked the herd from different approach angles, working themselves into a position to shoot. Matt and Mark had split up to stalk elk in different areas, and Matt hit the jackpot. In some dark timber he had located a herd and was sneaking through the trees toward them. His eyes were scanning the brush for the telltale white patch of fur on the rump of any nearby elk. As he carefully stalked his way through the trees, the quiet suddenly erupted into a rapid series of brush pops and tree limbs cracking. Matt turned around to see a large grizzly bear charging toward him from only a few yards away. Now Matt wasn't one of those unprepared types. Apart from his bow and arrows, he packed a hunting knife and a canister of bear spray. His bear spray was held in a holster on his belt. He knew he was in grizzly country, and having his bear spray easy to access was pivotal to his safety. Matt watched as the grizzly bounded over the uneven ground with its muscles rippling with each stride. It ate up ground at 10 feet per step, approaching Matt at an incomprehensible speed. In only a few seconds the bear had closed the distance between the bow hunter and itself with a fury that few could fathom. Matt could do little to avoid the bear's wrath at this point. As the experienced outdoorsman, he knew he had no chance of running away from it, and fighting might only make it more angry. His only hope was the bear's charge was a bluff, and that it would pull up just short of him, or veer off to escape after seeing he was a human. As the grizzly got to within a few feet, Matt had reached his hand to his bear spray. He pulled at the canister, but the bear was on him by the time he had touched the bear spray holster. With the grizzly now only a few feet from him, Matt lifted his right arm up and posted it in a defensive manner between himself and the bear's jaws. He looked straight into the bear's gaping mouth full of yellow teeth and watched as it drove them into the flesh of his forearm. As the bear clamped its jaws down on Matt's forearm, he heard the bones crack under the force. The grizzly tossed its head and ripped gaping holes into his forearm and pulled him even closer to it. As Matt was jerked forward by the grizzly's initial bite to his forearm, the bear swatted him across his head, opening up deep gashes anywhere they touched his flesh. With his head now split open with parallel gashes, the bear turned and disappeared into the timber as Matt crumpled to the ground. In a lightning-fast attack that lasted only a few seconds, the bear had left Matt wounded, bleeding, and dazed. It had begun and ended so quickly that he had to take a few minutes just to gather his wits. Matt quickly assessed his wounds and checked his legs to make sure they were still functional. After giving the bear enough time to leave the area around him, Matt started making his way back down the trail toward the truck. Back at the truck, Mark had already returned and was awaiting Matt's arrival. As he looked up the trail, he could see Matt's familiar camouflage jacket come into view above the brush along the trail. Mark didn't see anything out of the ordinary until Matt came within a few yards. As Matt explained his altercation with the grizzly bear, Mark looked over his wounds and realized they would need to head back immediately to get help for his injuries. Mark drove Matt to the Madison Valley Hospital in Ennis. Matt's wounds were cleaned and closed with sutures. His right forearm required more extensive medical interventions, though. His wounds eventually healed into scars he carried as a reminder of the bear's aggressive disposition and power. After Matt's attack was reported to officials, they canvassed the area in search of the grizzly that attacked him. They found a sow and 2 cubs in the area, but she did not demonstrate any aggressive reactions to the presence of the investigators. Given they couldn't tell if she was the bear that had attacked Matt, they took no actions against her and her cubs. The bear that attacked Matt was deemed to have been reacting in a defensive manner to a close-range encounter to a human being. Given it ran away after the brief attack and didn't try to kill Matt, its behavior was recognized as defensive. They made no comment indicating that they had discovered a cached animal carcass anywhere near the location of Matt's attack. A representative stated that Matt's attack was an example of archery hunters doing what they do and bears doing what they do. They also commented on the potential for bear attacks to happen whenever archery hunters or hikers enter known bear territory. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Are you surprised that Matt stalked very near to a grizzly bear without seeing it? Do you think the sow that was spotted after Matt's attack was the culprit, or was there another bear that could have been responsible? Were both Matt and the grizzly bear hunting the same elk herd? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.